Well, once again, it's Thursday at 5 o'clock here at Central Time. Thanks for listening to the Sin Bully radio program on the HD3 channel at KPFT. KPFT, Houston's commercial-free, listener-supported, dynamic, interesting, never know what to expect radio. That's us. I'm Evan McClanahan over at the HD3 channel here. I'm the pastor at First Evangelical Lutheran Church, a small church as it happens, relevant to our conversation today. But pastor over at First Evangelical Lutheran Church, you can email me there, emc2@felchouston.org, emc2@felchouston.org. And sin boldly. No, it's not the show where we encourage people to sin at all, much less to sin boldly, but rather to confess Christ boldly, to be a Christian boldly. You know, a lot of what the world says about being Christians, you know, they say it's wrong. So we say, well, if that's wrong, we don't want to be right. You know what I'm saying? So if loving Jesus is wrong, we don't want to be right. You know what I'm saying? Is that right? Okay, anyway. Yeah, thanks for listening to the Sin Bully radio program on KPFT. So, do check out sometime kpft.org and make a donation if you can. We are just about on our fundraising time, and that might mean that I might not put out a podcast for a week or two during that time, because I'm going to be doing some heavy fundraising, and I don't know if you're going to want to listen to it, but we'll see how that goes. But I've got a special guest with me today. He has found a way to write books for the small church and the small church pastor. You don't see that a lot. Most of the books written are for the big guys, you know, or really by the big guys, the pastors of large churches, because, of course, that is the ideal that we all strive for. So, Karl Vaters, he's the pastor at Cornerstone Congregation or Fellowship. Let me get the name right, Karl. What is it?
Cornerstone Christian Fellowship.
Christian Fellowship. I thought Fellowship was in there. So he's the pastor out there. He's the author of Grasshopper Myth. We talked about that in the past. He's been on twice before to talk about church growth generally. So, but very honored that he's been able to come on today to talk about his new book put out by Moody Publishers, Small Church Essentials, Field-Tested Principles for Leading a Healthy Congregation of Under 250. So, Karl, thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks. Honored to be back with you, Evan.
And I appreciate, by the way, the shout-out in your new book.
Hey, yeah, you're welcome. It was that we had that great talk with Gary McIntosh, especially, and he had a great quote. So, I learned at least as much as anybody else did on that podcast.
Yeah, well, I learned a lot. So it was that's what I like to. I just consider this radio show my ongoing, continuing education. So yeah, it's kind of and I don't have to go anywhere for it. I don't have to get on an airplane or anything. It's great. So, but I know that the Grasshopper Myth has done really well. I mean, it's attracted a lot of attention. You've got a blog as well. So, why don't you talk a little bit about the reception to the Grasshopper Myth and how that led to this new book?
Yeah, it's been 7 or 8 years ago that I went through a near meltdown in ministry after, living here in Orange County, just south of Disneyland, with all kinds of mega churches around me, and our church just didn't have the kind of growth that everybody said was inevitable if you follow these rules, and it didn't happen. So I had to reconfigure what success in ministry looked like, and I decided, you know what, if our church is going to stay small, we got to figure out how to do small really, really well. So I looked around to find help and found very, very little help to do that. So as I started finding bits and pieces, I thought, well, if I'm having a hard time finding it, maybe what I do find is of value and I should put it all in one place for others.
Yeah.
And so I wrote the Grasshopper Myth based on that. And the reception to it and to the blog was so strong and so immediate, it really kind of shocked me.
Yeah.
I knew the audience was large, fully half the Christians in the world and 90% of churches are under 250 people. So it's, half the Christian world and those leaders is what it's speaking to. So it's not a small market. It's not a small need. But and that's really what happened was the need was so big and the resources were so few that this really kind of clicked with people. And then, so the book really took off. It has been translated into, of all languages, Croatian.
Wow.
It is just about done with a German translation, and they've just started on a French translation.
Wow.
Which we hope to have done by the end of this year. So here I am in California, and I can't get a Spanish language translation done, but I got Croatian.
Yeah.
You take what you can get, yeah.
That's
and
funny.
It's a self-published book, so I'm doing all of that myself.
Wow.
And so that's part of the reason why some things go a little bit slower, because I don't have an agent or a publicist or a publisher or anything else. It's just
Yeah.
getting willing people to help who really have a passion for this as well.
Well, tell Moody just to pick it up for you and take it on from there. I mean, but
we're actually talking about that, eventually doing a kind of an updated version of it with
cool.
Moody as a publisher eventually.
Yeah. Good deal. Good deal. Well, yeah, like you said, it is definitely a big market, but what it speaks to is, I mean, it really identifies the personal struggle that a lot of pastors have being pastors of small churches, because, you really hit the nail on the head, and you say it in this book as well. We all kind of are pastors of small churches thinking, well, any day now, or we tell ourselves, well, those things happen to other people, but it won't happen to me. And, we all kind of envision ministry going, one way. I mean, I remember, this is embarrassing to admit, and I may have said it on previous shows, but, there was a time, when I was just getting into seminary, and I think in seminary, and I wrote out life goals or something like that. I don't know that I even have life goals anymore, but, I wrote out life goals, and one of them was to be this dynamic pastor and grow churches and then teach other churches how to grow churches. And I'm so embarrassed that I even ever thought such a thing, managed to write it down on paper. Thank the Lord for not striking me dead at such a moment. But that's just kind of how you think, when you sort of get into it. And like you said, look, most churches are small churches. Most people, therefore, at least like you say, half, want to be in small churches. There are things that small churches do well. So, and the new book really kind of unpacks that in even more detail. And the first thing that the small church pastor then has to do, I think, is come to peace to some degree with the fact that they're a pastor of a small church, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think you do a good job talking about that. Talk about maybe that mental, or maybe I should say spiritual transition of going from a pastor who's become to be defined as kind of failing, or a failure, or having done something wrong, to one who realizes, hey, it's okay to be this way. It's okay to be the pastor of a small church. Maybe it's even a good thing.
Yeah, and it is a difficult emotional and spiritual obstacle to overcome. It certainly was difficult for me. We just live in a culture where bigger is better, and that has made its way, unfortunately, into the church as well. And I think there are some aspects to it that are understandable, because if we are doing our calling, which for Christians includes reaching out to others to bring them into salvation, then it seems like, well, if our church is healthy and we're helping more people become followers of Christ, then that's going to mean there's more people in my church on Sunday, isn't it? Isn't that just a mathematical equation that works out that way?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems reasonable at first. And there certainly are churches for whom that does work out. Almost everybody that they reach out to for Christ ends up staying in the church, and the church grows. But for others, the equation just doesn't work out that way for all kinds of reasons, especially given our new, social media age. Churches have opportunities to reach out to people and to, actually bring them to faith in Christ. But for 1,001 reasons, they may never actually come and sit inside that congregation. Mm-hmm. So the big mind shift that needs to take place for a lot of us is that as long as we are being effective for the church universal, that is all those who are followers of Christ, then that's what matters, whether or not it has a positive numerical impact upon the congregation that I am serving.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's a tough hurdle to overcome, because all of us have a desire to see visual, visible, measurable success in the corner of the world that we inhabit.
Right.
That's just a natural desire to have, and it's not a bad desire.
Yeah.
But when that becomes more important than serving Christ and his church and ministering to people, whether or not they have numbers to my seats, then we've got a problem.
Yep. I mean, we want to make an impact. We want to, in fact, I was just talking to someone last night who was saying the word impactful, is not really a word. We've kind of made it a word, but, so if I could abuse a word, we want to be impactful. We want to make a difference. We want to kind of leave a mark somewhere along the way. We want to, we think to some degree it will kind of, I don't know, justify her being,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's natural. And I've kind of talked before about, we've got to come to terms too with, like, are we content to make a difference in the village, or do we want to have some kind of global impact? And I think the reality is, most of us at most, except for maybe the 10 talent man, right? I mean, most of us, we need to be content making a difference in the village, and then doing that in your small church, in your family. Don't neglect, doing the good that you can where you are, because you're destined for something better. Do the good where you are. That's
Yeah.
where you find yourself. So,
Yeah.
and yeah.
It goes back to the whole family dynamic. You want to change the world. Fix your bed in the morning.
Right.
Treat your family well. Do those small things, because those small things multiplied through the lives of millions and billions of other people is of a far greater impact to do good things for each other, for the kingdom of God, and for the world, than the grand leader who gets up and leads thousands or millions. I think there's value in both, but the cumulative effect of all the small things being done well by all these people will always be greater than the effect of a single dynamic leader of large group.
Right. Exactly. It reminds me of someone that's kind of come into our church family recently, and we've relatively welcomed him with, I think, open arms, and and he would talk about how he would visit other churches and he would just feel such hostility, given that he was maybe not coming from the best place at that time, or maybe he was not particularly healthy in his lifestyle and all of that. And that judgment he would feel would keep him out of church again, for some months before he had the courage to try again,
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, but those were cases where it's like, you can make a difference right here, but you missed the opportunity. Well, let's talk about the book a little bit. You begin by talking about how, every pastor is going to be a pastor of a small church. Even if you are destined for, great things, you're going to either start small, or you're going to be placed, depending on your denomination, perhaps in a small congregation to learn the art of pastoring. And so there's some piece that you have to come to about that. But in a small church, you talk about, not settling. So talk about that a little bit, because one thing that can happen, and this is the trend that we want to fight against, is just because you're small doesn't mean you have an excuse not to continue to be the best church that you can be. You don't just say, well, what can we do? We're small. So talk about getting out of that settling mindset.
Yeah, the phrase I like to use is small is not a problem, a virtue, or an excuse. So, it's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with being small. Small can be valuable. Secondly, it's not a virtue. Small is not better than big.
Yeah.
But to address your question directly, small is also not an excuse. If you take a look at the New Testament, there is no command to the New Testament church that cannot be fulfilled by 2 or 3 people gathered in Christ's name. You don't need a building to do it. You don't need a budget to do it. You don't need a large crowd to do it. The commands of Christ are doable in even the smallest groups. So if your group is small, if your church is small, if it's been small just because you started, or it's been small for a long time, what we need to do, let's say you've got a church of 20 and you're thinking, well, we're going to wait until we're a church of 100 to do something big. Well, if you don't do the 20 size well, one, you're never going to get bigger, because who would want to go to a place that's not doing what they're doing well?
Right.
But secondly, if you do the things of a church of 20 well, and you don't get bigger, well, then at least you've gotten healthy, and at least you're doing 20 well.
Right.
But instead, what we do is we push for bigger, bigger, bigger. And then if that fails, then we've got nothing to show for it, because we didn't do 20 well, and we didn't get to the 100 we wanted to get to. So it's all a failure.
Yeah.
But if you figure out what does it look like to be a great church of 20 or 50 or 100, and you do that well, if growth happens, then it's like an extra little benefit.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't, at least you can look around and go, wow, look at what our church of 100 is doing. It's extraordinary, the impact that we're having. We're what's the phrase everybody loves to use? We're boxing above our weight.
Right.
We're having an impact beyond our footprint is the phrase that I like to use.
Yeah.
And that's the thing with our congregation even right now. We run on the high end of small, 150 to 170 on a typical Sunday morning. But we have an impact way bigger than our footprint, because we decided years ago that we're going to figure out how to do this size as well as we possibly can, while also preparing for if numerical growth happens to come, we'll receive that and we'll grow with it.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, we're going to be this size, and we're going to be the best church of this size that we can.
Right. And we'll get into some of that nitty gritty in a little bit. I mean, you talk a lot about, how, what do you do with new ideas, and how do you try out new ministries and that sort of thing. So yeah, that is super important. I wanted to ask as well. Oh, there was a question I had. I don't want to get to the different part yet, but yeah, a lot of times what'll happen is in smaller churches, basically people will say, well, gosh, we don't have enough, to do this. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Of course, Jesus says, you're entrusted with the little things, so, now you can get something bigger. So, and that seems to be overlooked as well in small churches. It's like, well, Jesus himself, will give you certain things to see if you can be responsible for this thing. Can you tend it? Can it grow? Can it be healthy? And that sort of thing. So, you don't just say, well, I'm entitled to this.
Yeah. In using that, though, one thing I want to reiterate, and I know you're aware of it, but we often don't state it, so it's sometimes misheard. Sometimes people hear that as, okay, if I'm responsible for a few things, then I'm going to be blessed with more things.
Right.
But that's not really what the parable says. The parable is telling us if we are responsible for those few things, then we will be able to be responsible for more things, for bigger things. So it's not about I do a little bit well and now I get overwhelmed with blessing. It's if you can handle a church of 20 that's going well, then maybe you're going to be responsible for a church of 20 that goes through a massive crisis, and now you have a greater degree of responsibility. Yeah. And because you've been tested in it when it was going well, the Lord now trusts you to help to manage and work and bless it through a time of crisis. It may not be bigger numbers. It may just simply be bigger responsibility.
Yeah. That's a great point. I appreciate that. I've known a fair amount of, and I'm not sure what to do about this actually, but, I think what can happen is that pastors can end up in small churches and they can sort of hide behind those excuses too. And I don't know that there's any solution for a pastor who just doesn't have a lot of, passion or desire to do work in God's kingdom. But I have seen a fair amount of pastors who really just didn't care very much, and it was a small church, and they could kind of manage it just fine. It didn't require too much. I heard stories. A friend of mine was on internship, and he said his internship supervisor would, pretty well take 2 hours to read the newspaper every morning. And I remember thinking, what pastor has the time to read the paper for 2 hours? I know the old thing about the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, right? So that you're up to date with what's going on in the world. But do you really need to know? Do you really need to read the paper for 2 hours? So I don't know. I mean, there's something about small churches that can maybe, pastors can find themselves situated in that, hey, maybe need to. That's not incredibly healthy either. So, yeah, the push for health is needed.
I think that happens for one of two reasons. I think there are simply lazy people in the world.
Yeah.
And some of them go into pastoral ministry. We're not exempt from, all of the foibles and sins that anybody else has to experience. But I think the second part of it is, and probably for more than the first, is that when you've got the bigger is better mentality, and you spend some time and it doesn't get bigger, and the things that everybody says will work don't work, you get discouraged, you get frustrated, and you just kind of give up. And so what sometimes looks like laziness is actually discouragement.
Yeah.
So
well,
there are some lazy ones, but most of them I think are just discouraged.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, again, it's really about, and this is kind of my main takeaway, it's being content, with the people that God has given you to serve, and being happy doing that service, rather than always saying, well, gosh, I don't have enough to, I don't have enough resources, Lord, I don't have enough people, I don't have enough this. And that's a mindset that we have to take on. I want to touch on a point that it's kind of amazing when I say heard, because I actually listened to your book. So I didn't physically read it, but so as I remember it, I heard it. But something that you said in your book, and you talk about kind of how smaller churches maybe are weird, and how different small churches are. And it was just amazing how you talk about, how every small church is really radically different, right? So, and I'm trying to find the exact quote, but it was something along the idea of, if you take two churches that are each small, maybe under 100 people, they will be more different. In fact, here, let me read this. It says, the differences between the 20,000 member church that the conference speaker pastored and the less than 100 member church that I pastored were bigger than I had imagined. So, you talk about how utterly different a church of under 100 people are from each other, right down the street from each other, similar denominations and all that. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that goes from something that's called the law of large numbers. And law of large numbers is a sociological phenomenon. Any listener can Google it and you'll see it. And what it states is that the larger the group, the more predictably they behave, and the smaller the group, the less predictably they behave. This is what makes polling companies work. As long as they have a minimum sample size and they ask the right question with the right demographics and so on, if you get a minimum sample size, you can then just add zeros and you're going to be correct for a larger group within a 2 or 3 point margin of error.
Yeah.
But you have to have the minimum sample size, and the minimum sample size is in the thousands. So once you get down, so if you for instance ask the right questions in the right ways to 4,000 people, and that's your minimum sample size, then you can just add zeros and it'll be the same for 40,000 or for 400,000 because you've got enough data. But if you drop that down to 400, certainly if you drop that down to 40, your sample size is too small. And the reason it's too small is when you're only talking to 40 people, you can have it skewed really strongly to the left or to the right, to liberal, to conservative, to progressive, to fundamentalist or whatever, because you've got such a small group of people. So individual attitudes factor in much more strongly, and outliers can sometimes affect a small group significantly. So that's why you can have two churches of 20,000 on different parts of the world, but when you go on their campus, it feels similar because you have to have systems in place to manage the movement of 20,000 people on a Sunday, and those systems are going to be similar across the board, similar to when you go to the mall or Disneyland. It's a management of crowds that simply has to take place. So there's a similar feel. But when you get down to a congregation, let's say two congregations of 50, they can be of the same denomination on the same street in the same town and be radically different because one group of 50 is very different from another group of 50 because every individual has a higher influence on the group.
Yeah. Yeah, that's remarkable when you say that. It's like I've always known that, but I've never actually realized it, if that makes any sense.
Me too. Yeah.
Yeah. Because, of course, it makes sense when you think about, say, the megachurch. I mean, you do kind of have in your mind what they look like. I mean, kind of the setup and, kind of the, the fact that, things get out at a certain time and maybe the, the way preaching is done or the way music is done or, even lighting and, things of that. I mean, there's kind of a uniformity there because they have to. I mean, if you have that many people, you have to do things in a certain way. But gosh, I mean, every church I've ever been at, between internship and my first call, I'm now at my second call, which in a certain sense has had enough transition over the years, given that we're in the middle of Houston. It's almost like my second or third or fourth call, but, various churches, they're all different. They've all been very different, even though they've been in pretty much the same, denomination, that sort of thing. Worship styles were different, ideas were different, and all the characters were different, because all the eccentricities of all the people involved just rise to the floor, for better or worse. So.
Yeah. So that's one of the big challenges that the small church pastor has. Big church pastors have different challenges, so I'm not making one more difficult or easier than the other. But one of the challenges the small church pastor has is that in addition to figuring out the universal principles that apply to all churches and the universal small church principles, what I call the small church essentials, that apply to all small churches, they've also got to figure out and take the temperature of this unique group of people so that they can understand how to minister uniquely to what I call the "why is my church so weird" part.
Yeah. What do
that's why.
What do you think seminaries, and that's a big word, but what do you think seminaries prepare people for? Which dynamic?
Seminaries to a large degree are preparing people who can think theologically. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah.
There's some practical training, but they start with the theological foundation and then add practical training to that. And that's not wrong, that's not bad, but it makes it when you go through that and then you go into the church, you begin to realize that, in fact, real life works the opposite. It's practical, hands-on ministry that is supported by your theological training rather than theological training that has some practical ministry added to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of people leave seminary and think they're going to spend all their time in Bible study and in teaching people deep theological truths, and they find out, no, they're spending more time unclogging the toilet than they expect.
Right. Yeah. I know. They should definitely have a handyman course somewhere along the way in seminary.
I agree. And I'm not even being facetious when I say that. That needs to be. They need new seminarians at least need to be aware of that reality.
Yeah, I'm serious. I mean, it might come in handy to be able to do a sheetrock repair. I mean, you talk about a ministry bonding experience with one of your parishioners. If you're,
it literally happened today in my congregation.
Yeah.
On Thursdays is the one day of the week that they don't empty the dumpster, and I came into church today and the dumpster was already over full because they're doing some construction.
Yeah.
And so I thought, if the janitors come tonight and dump on top of that, it'll be overfull, and they won't remove the dumpster tomorrow.
Right,
It'll have to be flattened down. So I went in, and two of our interns, they weren't doing anything. So I said, guys, I need you to go out, and I need you to make room in that dumpster. And they went, what? I said, you got to stomp on it, whatever. I guarantee you there's air pockets under there. So they went out, and they're jumping up and down on the dumpster, and they created a space. And as they finished, I walked by, and I said, that's the kind of stuff you only get in the practical internship.
Yep.
You don't get that in Bible college.
Boy,
they're just laughing, but that's the reality of it. That's got to be done.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. So,
well,
let's kind of talk about maybe some of the more practical things. I'm trying to scroll through the book here, but what are some of the if you wanted to kind of highlight some of the most important tools, because you talk about tools in the book. And if you want to do more foundation, that's okay too. But, what are some of the kind of tools that, we need to start thinking about to be a good small church?
Yeah, one of the things, and I think this is the title of chapter 9 or 10, we need to discover what your church does well.
Yeah.
Too often what we do is we'll take a look at a church that we like, a church that we want to be like, and we say, well, I'm going to be like North Point or Hillsong or Lakewood or whatever, and I'm going to just kind of do that. And what happens is you just end up being a cheaper copy of the original.
Yeah.
And that's not a small church diss or a big church diss. That's just how life is. If you are in a band and you decide you want to cover U2 songs, you're going to be a lesser version of U2. You're not going to do them better than U2 did them.
Right.
Right. That's just the nature of it. So when you were starting out, at times, in fact, I'm writing a blog post right now for church planters. My best advice is be a great cover band. Find great churches that you love and emulate them, but then don't stay there. Make it become your own. But so we get to the point where we got to figure out what we do well. What does this unique group of people do well? How do they come together in a way that is different, that is new, that is fresh, that is exciting, that is what God is calling us to do? And then figure out how to do it together in the best way possible. So instead of looking at some other church and trying to duplicate it, look at the ingredients in front of you. In the book, I use the illustration from the scene from Apollo 13, and in the movie, which is a description of obviously the real life events, the astronauts are just about to choke to death on their own breath because the filter system has got a glitch in it where they've got a square filter for a round hole or a round for square. I can't remember which. Yeah. And they can't figure out how to fix it. So the engineer takes a box, puts it on the table, and on the table is every single thing that is on Apollo 13. And he tells the other engineers, we have to figure out how to fix this problem using nothing but what's on that table. Because if it's not on the table, it's not on Apollo 13 and they can't use it.
Right.
So I think to me that is a great description of how a small church works or how a small business works, for goodness sake. These are the ingredients that I've got. Stop wishing and praying for ingredients that don't exist. At some point they may be able to come along, but right now that's what's on my table.
Right.
So let's figure out what can be done in the best possible way with the ingredients that are on my table. And if you do that, I believe then that's the 1 or 5 talent servant doing the best with what they've got, and then God says, I will now honor that to give you a higher degree of responsibility because you've shown that you can do it with the ingredients I gave you.
Yeah. And I thought you were going to tell the story, too, of the the archer, right? Who's
Oh,
arrows into the side of the barn, right? And everyone is right in the middle of the bullseye, and the guy comes out
hmm
and says, "Wow, you're an amazing archer," and then so the guy goes around to the other side, and he, not to give the whole book away here, but but he shoots arrows in the other side of the barn, but then he takes spray paint and does a circle around each arrow. So the idea being, yeah, what are the ministries that you do well as a small church, maybe
and draw a target around them. Yeah.
and then focus on them and do them really well. I'm trying to think of ministries, that maybe a small church, a typical, if you will. There's no such thing as a typical small church, actually.
Exactly.
But maybe you have a great food pantry, or maybe you can do a particular outreach if you're near a school or a college. I knew a church that was across the street from, I think it was a high school, and they basically reached out to that high school and said, we just want to have a presence at the high school. And so they were just there. They I think did tutoring and mentoring and were even present in the halls at certain times. I mean, they were just kind of known as the church that had kind of adopted the school. There are there's all sorts of things. You talk as well about, having a potentially international, impact again through, media that we've never had, podcast or blog post. I mean, you never know what might be of help to somebody somewhere else in the world. So,
oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's no question that through this in your podcast, you probably have had a greater impact on a higher number of people through what we're doing right now than on Sunday morning, and the same for me.
Right.
But we don't see it because most people don't comment that I read it or I heard it, and because we don't see the results visibly, we don't think we have results. And that's a big part of where the faithfulness needs to step in, and we have to say, I'm going to remain faithful. I'm not going to be able to see all of those results, so I have to believe that God is going to do that whether I see it or not,
right,
and be okay with that. And that's not easy to do, but it is possible.
Right. Yeah, it's actually, when you sometimes stop and think about it, it's kind of mind-boggling to think of, how technology has changed this, because, if let's say I had an event at my church. I mean, well, this has happened. I mean, let's say I hosted a debate and only 100 people came to the debate, but 20,000 people watch it on YouTube. It's just crazy, how to think how, and 20,000 is not even a lot, but relatively, it's more than I could fit in the sanctuary. So,
yeah. Imagine if you had the 20,000 people actually show up physically. That would be, that would make news on the local station.
Right.
You had 20,000 people show up for that debate.
Yeah.
But because they're online, nobody pays attention to it.
Exactly.
They just as legitimately had that experience.
Exactly. So that's something you have to be content with. And in a lot of ways, I do think that we need to probably change ministries to some degree to just thinking of them as digital resources. And the scary part about that, because, it's kind of funny that you're coming on this week, because last week I had a guy on, Richard Jacobson, a guy, I didn't mean that to sound pejorative, but a gentleman, Richard Jacobson, and he wrote a book called Unchurching. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but
I have, and I've got it saved on my phone. I'll be listening to it on my flight next week.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's basically, he kind of makes the argument, well, we don't actually need the church anymore. It's like some things I've heard him say on his podcast are like, everyone has all these digital resources now. It's like, well, yeah, but they're available because there's some church with infrastructure supporting that, It's like, yeah, you can just listen to stuff online. It's like, no, yeah, but someone had to host the event, or,
Well, and when I'm gone, when my wife and I are going to be on vacation for 3 weeks, and we're going to Skype with our grandson just about every day.
Yeah.
But for us to think, well, we don't ever need to actually be physically present with him anymore. We can do it through Skype.
Right.
I mean, it's a ridiculous thought. And the idea that we can do church only that way as well. The way I like to phrase it is this: digital church is real church. It's just not enough church.
Yeah. Good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not be pejorative about it. Accept the good for what it is, but it's not the same. There is a need for that community, yeah. Yep. But so figure out I mean, that's a very basic thing, is just, and I think there's really something powerful too about a church having confidence. And one of the things that it's not just pastors, small churches themselves, I think, can develop low morale. I even notice it in my church. Like the other day we had, among us in worship, 73 souls. I'm always careful to not say we worshiped 60 people, because we don't. We worship one God. But anyway, we had 73 people. Now, for us, that was a good day. And it was so much that I had so many people say, wow, we had a lot of people today. We had 73 people. Because normally we have about probably 60 or 65. And wouldn't you know, 73, those 7 people, I mean, it makes a difference, And so I think that small churches can kind of end up kind of having low morale. And if you focus on what you do, this is kind of my point, and you do it well, that small thing that you do well can give a church confidence. Hey, we started a ministry, and it worked. It did a good job. So you tell a great fable before that, in actually a previous chapter. So not to go backwards too much, but of the leaky cabin. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. It's an old fable. I can't remember where I heard it the first time, but a guy's going to a friend's cabin in the woods, and it's a rainy day, and he gets there and he knocks on the door. His friend opens up the door, and when he walks in the cabin, it's leaking all over the place, and there are buckets with water dripping in it. He's grateful to be, out of the main rain, but he looks around and goes, "Man, we need to fix that roof." And the guy goes, "Yeah, but it's raining right now. You can't fix it while it's raining." So he thinks, "Yeah, that's true. Okay." So they go to bed. They get up at night. They get up in the morning, and it's a beautiful sunny day. And he says, "Hey," to the buddy who owns the cabin, "Hey, why don't we go up and fix that roof now?" And the buddy goes, "Why? It's not leaking now."
Right.
And I think for a lot of churches, that's often how we behave when we're in the middle of crisis. Is not the time to try to fix the root cause of the crisis.
Right.
You just have to get through to the other side. But then after the crisis is over, we need to come back and we need to revisit the root cause of the crisis. The challenge is nobody wants to visit a problem intentionally. We want to avoid problems.
Yeah.
The same thing happens in marriages. Whenever I do marriage counseling, I use the same illustration because I'll ask a couple if they've got a particular fight, and they'll say, "We constantly fight about money," or "We constantly fight about the in-laws," or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'll ask them, "Have you ever sat down and had a conversation about that issue when you weren't in the middle of a fight over it?" And they look at me like I'm crazy.
Right.
Like, why would we intentionally go into that danger zone? And I say, that's why you're not resolving it, because the only time you're talking about it is when you're mad about it.
Right.
You need to sit down in the cold, hard light of a clear, sunny day and get up on the roof and fix it when you're not mad about it, when you're not raining.
Right.
And churches are the same thing. If we're only going from crisis to crisis and we can't figure out why we're not moving forward, that's why. You can't repair the roof while it's raining.
Yeah.
You've got to go back when things are steady and say, okay, that last time when we had that issue, let's talk about why we had that issue. Let's talk about why it went wrong. Let's have a rational, sane, non-angry discussion about it.
Yeah.
And most churches that are stuck aren't doing that. They're just moving from crisis to crisis.
Yep. Yeah. No, I think that very few, and part of it is because let me complete one thought before I go to the other. Yeah. Very, very few churches do a good job of that kind of strategic planning. You're right. It is crisis to crisis. It's like what problem do I have to fix today? I remember, one of the things that I did. There's a couple things that I've done well in my ministry. One is we put up some metal gates in our bell tower to keep the pigeons out, so the bell tower's floor is not constantly covered with pigeon poop. That's one of the things I'm most proud of in my ministry. I want everyone to know that. I want to be forever known as the pastor that kept the pigeons out of the bell tower. I didn't actually do the work. It was just my idea. Anyway. But the other thing is we used to have council meetings where the first things on our council or board meetings were the property, the finances, maybe something else. But it was basically like all the things that make us go, oh, we're running a deficit. Oh, we got a roof leak to fix. And it's like, and then we would get to like ministry. So a few years ago, I said, okay, the council agenda is going to look like this. We have to establish the agenda, establish a quorum, approve the minutes, and then we're going to talk about our ministries. Here are the 5 ministries that we talk about first, and then we'll talk about finance and property and stuff that, but by then we have momentum on our side. It's like then we've talked about the things that we're doing, the events that we've hosted, the outreach that we did. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves. We have problems to fix along the way. So, yeah, I think it was very common to always have a crisis to fix, and no one was ever taking a step back and saying, what are some of the ministries that we're doing? But what I was going to say is that I think a lot of pastor types, just in fact, listening to your book, it was something I was very convicted about, and so maybe you can offer me some free therapy here. but is kind of strategic thinking, and kind of planning and being very intentional about, kind of what you want to do and how to go about doing it. I mean, that's one of the things, that I have to force myself to do that sort of thing. And maybe it's because I'm afraid of failure. So I kind of feel like if I just keep winging it, and it doesn't work out, well, no big deal. So, I don't know, maybe could you talk about that a little bit? Because, you do talk about how to implement ministries, how to let ministries go, and things of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I love your idea of the agenda. With our staff agenda every week, the first 3 or 4 items, we start with prayer, and then we go into assessing the things that worked last weekend. We talk about share your ministry, celebrate your ministry successes. And so we start with all of these things that are positive, that are uplifting, and that reestablish in everybody's heart the reason we're in the room.
Yeah.
It reestablishes the mission. Then when we get to the broken water heater, we're going into it with a positive mindset of forward-moving ministry, and we can even see how fixing the water heater matches into the overall ministry because we framed it by the positive ministry that we're doing.
Right.
So starting with those things and constantly keeping what the old thing is, keep the main thing the main thing.
Yeah. Water heaters go
that
out.
Simply means talk about it first.
Right. Water heaters go out at your church too? Yeah. Yeah, I've had 2 go out. I'm glad. I think we're good to go on water heaters for the next 5 years, but you never know.
You do never. I'm in Southern Cal, as like you're in Houston. Air conditioners are usually a bigger issue than water heaters. Yeah,
I'm always worried about the air conditioner. So I got a plan for it though. I'm working on it. I have a long-term strategy for that. But you talk about too, dealing with particular personalities. That's something you have to deal with in a small church. What would you? Let me ask you this: what would you say the number of weekly attendees is that where a pastor transitions from knowing, the majority of people in worship to really, and spending time, spending most of his time with members of the congregation to spending most of his time with staff, I mean, that one of the things I've noticed is like in a larger church, program driven, the pastor spends most of his time with only the staff and only the very, very active volunteers, the council president and things like that. But there's not a lot of other time amongst, other kind of, what would you say is kind of that cutoff?
Well, it's called the 200 barrier, and it's always the big conversation in every church growth conference and book, because that's the barrier. And they call it the 200 barrier. It actually happens anywhere from around 150 to 300, depending on a whole bunch of factors. But, if you got a church of 50, you can literally know everybody and literally be available for them to a reasonable degree, not the high need people, but the average need people. You can pretty much be there and you can pastor them individually. Once you hit 100, then you're going to hopefully have 1 or 2 folks who can come alongside and take care of some of that for you. Maybe the women's ministries department director, the choir leader, they're going to take care of those. The youth pastor is going to take care of the younger. But you still are dealing with it relationally, and you're spending even a majority of your time with average members and maybe 25 to 30% of your time training leaders. But once you hit the 200 level, and again, that's anywhere from 150 to about 300, you have to start spending more of your time with leaders than with regular members. One, you can't know every member anymore. There's just too many people. 2, you can't serve them all yourself because you're not God, you're not omnipresent. You can only be in one place at one time, and you have limitations. So you have to train leaders to do the pastoral work that you used to be able to do yourself when the church was smaller. And that's neither bad or wrong. It's simply a function of size.
Yeah.
So that I think one of the reasons why I think most churches are under 200, and like 90% of churches in the world are under 250 or so.
Right.
I think one of the primary reasons for that is most pastors are like you and me, and our primary call is to shepherd people, not to manage systems.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that we are supposed to do ministry for people. What I call the pastoral prime mandate in Ephesians 4:11 and 12 says that the role of the pastor, along with the other four ministry leaders that are mentioned there, is to equip the saints to do the work of ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So even in a church of 50, it is not the pastor's calling to do the ministry for those 50 people. It's the pastor's calling to equip those people to do ministry. But in a church of 50, you can do it one-on-one with people.
Yeah.
In a church of 100, you can do it in small mentoring groups. And once you become a church of 250 or 300, you have to train disciples who become disciple makers.
Right. Right.
But the process is the same, but the bigger the church gets, the more distance there is between the pastor and the average member, simply as a function of geography and, mortality.
Yeah.
We just can't be there for everybody.
Right. And generally, I mean, I think that most people choose, I mean, let's say half, right, in the world, choose to be a part of a small group, because that's the kind of environment they want. They don't want to be in a program-driven environment. At the same time, I've certainly, our church has lost members, if you will. That's not the best way to really phrase that, but they have gone on to other churches within God's kingdom because they wanted those programs, I mean, our Sunday school class for younger kids, has 4 kids in it, and for older kids, it has 3 or 4 kids in it, but if you want, a Sunday school class for like each grade level and, that sort of thing, and each one has its own classroom, we just don't have that, so,
Exactly.
But someone who's comfortable with the idea that, you're going to have kids who are 12 to 15 years old together, and you're going to have kids 8 to 12 together, they're fine with that. It's no big deal.
Yeah,
but
and some people like the idea of the small church because they look around and they go, I don't want every member of my family delivered into a separate group on Sunday. I want my family to sit together, to worship together, for the young to get to know the old and the old to get to know the young, and for us to learn from each other. And so for some families, maybe you've got a family that for them, the idea that the 2 brothers who aren't getting along are actually in separate classes, one for junior high and high school, maybe that's the break they need on Sunday.
Yeah. Right.
But for another family, they want the church environment to help them to foster the togetherness in the family that they want, and it can't happen when in church they're in separate rooms, just like in school they're in separate rooms.
Right. Yeah, I think that some churches, and we're kind of getting more and more this way. We're not there explicitly yet, but there are some churches that want the whole family in worship the whole time. No matter how much noise the child is making. I mean, sure, you could have maybe a cry room or something, but yeah, I mean, that's a whole philosophy, that many churches adopt very, very strongly. So, that's okay. Churches can be different.
It wouldn't work for me. That would drive me nuts. I have a complete appreciation for those for whom that does work.
Yeah.
And if that does work for them, don't tell them it's wrong. It's not. It works for them.
Yep. You talk. Or go ahead.
No, that's it.
Okay. You talk about decluttering. Ministries.
Oh,
so, first of all, I'd love it if you could come to my house. We have an old house. Our closets are very small, so we need all the help we can get. But actually, my wife told me today for Lent, she's going to be giving away 1 article of clothing per day for Lent, and then giving it away after Lent. And I thought, wow, that's a very Anyway, I was happy to hear that. Let's just put it that way. Like I said, old house, small closets. So, but one of the things that one of the common mistakes that small churches can make is maybe they're spread too thin. So how do you go about that painful process of evaluating ministry, what's going good, especially if a ministry that's not particularly effective might be someone's pet project. So how do you kind of go through that evaluation process?
Yeah, I start with 2 very simple questions. One, what ministries are we doing well that we'd like to do more of? And what ministries are we doing poorly that we would like to do less of? It's a really simple question. And if you ask it to an appropriate group of people, and by appropriate, I don't mean people who have positions. I mean the people who are willing to actually have an open conversation rather than just complain and moan about everything. And in a small church, we know who those people are. So we sit down with people who are actually going to take the question seriously and go, let's take a look at all the ministries we do. Let's actually put it on a whiteboard or something and ask ourselves, which of these ministries do we do really well? And boy, if we could do more of that, that would be great. And what ministries do we do poorly, or they're simply not effective, and maybe we should do less of it or not do it at all.
Yeah.
And when you ask that kind of open-ended, non-threatening, non-agenda kind of question, and if you truly don't have an agenda, if you're doing it because you're trying to manipulate it to get the one you dislike out of the way or to promote your pet project, they'll see through that and it won't work. But if you can do it from a truly open standpoint and say, I don't have a dog in this fight, I'm not trying to manipulate the process, I think we just have too big a menu and we need to narrow it down to the few things we do well. And then start asking it based on what do we do well and what's effective and what don't we do well or is not effective. When you start the conversation there, then I think people can start opening up to doing that. The second, I think, big thing is they have to see in the pastor a willingness for us to let go. There are times when the pastor is the control freak in the room.
Yep.
And we're the ones that have to have our agenda, and everything about it is just a way to sneak our agenda in. And if we can have the humility to go, you know what, I've always insisted on doing it this way, but I'm beginning to discover that it may just be my personal preference.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? Is this something that we need to let go that I'm hanging on to that I shouldn't? And simply the humility and vulnerability to ask that question will open people up in a whole lot of situations.
Yeah.
The clutter idea, if you want, I can throw in the closet illustration for that. There's a rule for people who live in very crowded cities, like if you're in the middle of Manhattan and every time you step out into the street, you're judged by what you're wearing and it's got to be the latest thing. But you're in this tiny little apartment that has a closet that's only 3 feet wide. Well, how do you always dress in the latest thing when you got this tiny little closet? Well, they do a thing they call the closet rule. And the closet rule very simply is you don't put a new garment into your closet until you take an old garment out of your closet.
Yeah.
And by doing that, you're always refreshing it with new things, and you're always making sure that anything that is even slightly stale dated gets removed. Now, most small churches have tiny closets, sometimes physically, but let's talk metaphorically for now.
Yep.
And so and by a closet, we only have the ability to do a certain number of ministries well. But we've gone to the big church conference, and there's this whole list of things, and they say, you've got to do all these things well. You've got to have age-graded Sunday school, and you've got to have a worship team, and you've got to have a women's ministries, and you've got to have this. And we're trying to do this massive menu of ministries, but we don't have the capacity for it. Our closet isn't big enough to hold all that clutter. So when we look at a new ministry, we need to look at it and go, okay, if I'm going to do a new ministry, what work ministry that is no longer effective am I going to remove in order to do the new one? And I think some churches need to do a 2-for-1 sale. You know, and in fact, most of the time, the rule in our church is we are always looking for ways to simplify and strip things back. Just this past summer we did it. We knew that we were about to lose our children's ministries leader, and we did not have a replacement in place because she had not been in place long enough to train a replacement for her, which we always are working on. So because she'd been short-term, she hadn't trained a replacement, we knew we were going to be without a primary leader. So I sat down at the beginning of summer and I wrote out the list of the 5 things that we do with our kids. And then I looked at those 5 things and I put them in order of priority. What's the most important thing we do and what is the least important thing we do? They're all important, but they all had to have a priority. And then I looked at the most important thing, which was, for us, making sure the kids are well cared for and taught well during the Sunday morning service while their parents are in adult service. That, to us, was the highest priority. Yeah. And then I asked myself, what would happen if we only did that? If we took all of the time, all of the money, all the resources, all the work hours that were going into those 5 events and told everybody we're going to put all of that into this one event. Yeah. So I came up with the idea. I presented it to our leaders. I presented it to our kid ministry leaders. And they all went, oh, that would be great. You mean I don't have to show up on Wednesday? You mean we don't have to do VBS this year? You mean we don't have to worry about trunk or treat? You mean we don't have to? No, we're going to put it all on Sunday morning, and we will add other things only one at a time as we believe we have the capacity for it. Yeah. And they loved it because now Sunday morning is way better than it's been in a long time because we're putting everything for kids into that one event rather than scattering it across 5 and doing the 5 of them only half well.
Yeah, yeah. That's awesome. That's a great example. we've only got a few minutes left.
Alrighty.
Let's talk about. There's so much more in the book. So for those listening, we haven't even made it halfway into the book. So you need to buy the book. That's the most important thing. And by the way, when is it available? It's not. It's on. You can get it via Amazon. It's through Moody Press, so it's easily available. So
March 6th is the release date. March
all right.
6th, so just a couple weeks.
Awesome. So
and you can pre-order today, and then they'll send it on that day. But
cool.
That's when it'll come out.
Good deal. Well, let's talk about small groups a little bit, because this is one of those, and we've talked about it before, but it's just one of those persistent issues. I've thought a lot about small groups. My first call was at a church that had maybe 500 souls in worship on Sunday. So one of my callings there was to start small groups, and I read lots of books about small groups and had some success with it. But actually, it's kind of more like what you described. It's like it didn't always kind of work out. What say you to small church pastors about small groups, especially because they're probably feeling a lot of pressure to produce, small groups, and maybe they found it frustrating. So,
the first rule that I would have is try as best you can to put aside all of the teaching you've heard about small groups and ask yourself this: if other pastors weren't telling you that small groups were necessary in your church, would the need have been obvious to you by just looking at your church? And if not, then you probably don't need small groups. The reason church growth people push small groups is a valid reason. When your church is really big, then you tend to attract passive consumers. And so you are always trying to push people into small groups where they'll become active participants.
Yeah.
But when people go to a small group, to a small church, they typically go to a small church because they know the relationships will be closer. They know they'll be more active. And if you're pastoring a healthy small church, your church may be a small group and you're good to go. And so you may want to work on bringing everybody together more than separating them out into small groups, because they're already getting the value of small groups on Sunday morning, by hanging out before service, after service, going out to lunch. So you need to assess, do we really need it? Would the need have been obvious if others hadn't been telling me I needed to do so?
Yeah. Well, that's a really freeing word, I think, because I think a lot of people, no matter the church size, they feel like if we're not doing small group ministry, we're doing something wrong. And again, I think it's okay to stop, kind of look around and say, the people that are at this small church, are here because they want to be here, and they're okay with the size. They're not worried about it. They're not panicked about it. This is exactly the church that they chose, and dare I say that God, put the two of you together even. So,
and I'm not saying small churches shouldn't do small groups. I'm saying if it's not working, then maybe it's not for you. You don't need to.
Well, that's what's really nice about your both your books. I mean, there's really a freeing kind of a truly encouraging, voice there, because I just think that so many small church pastors, they don't ever hear a word of encouragement. It's kind of like preaching that's all law and no gospel, and you really offer a very encouraging word and a freeing word, about the realities of ministry, and I think that's very much needed. So, folks, I'm sure people that listen to the podcast, they're in small churches. You don't have a lot of books written for you. So here's a good one: Small Church Essentials by Karl Vaters. That's Karl with a K and Vaters with a T, not like Darth Vader. Karl Vaters, and Moody Publishers put out the book Small Church Essentials: Field-Tested Principles for Leading a Healthy Congregation of Under 250. So, Karl, thanks so much again. I'm going to, we'll put this out on the podcast, of course, but I'd also like to put it out on YouTube, just, so that it's Googleable and people could listen to it and be a little bit easier for people to find.
Wonderful to be with you again, Evan. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon. All right. Bye-bye. All right. There he was, Karl Vaters. Appreciate that. Super nice guy. And one day I got to get out to California and say hello in person. And they do a lot of neat stuff, a lot of neat things at their church. And like I said, he is truly an encouraging guy. Because I think he understands the kind of depths that you can get to when your church doesn't grow and you think as a pastor you're doing everything wrong. And so I think he kind of understands that, hey, look, there is life after, maintaining a small church. That's okay. So anyway, Small Church Essentials, check it out. I enjoyed reading it. I'm sure you will as well. And until next week, where I'm hoping to have a debate between Christians on global warming, should be fun. May you have the peace that passes all understanding. See ya.
And devious trouble finds me listening to the man that's south of my head. Ears are ringing, spines are tingling, out of patience.